Okay. Can we all see that? You got it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we begin. The first halacha into chapter 16. A blemished house is a primary source of impurity. It's from what we call avot hatumot. Anyone who touches it contracts impurity. Similarly, the stones that are removed from it after it was isolated, or the stones, the wood, and the mortar of the house, when it is destroyed, as we've learned about in the previous chapters, all are considered as primary sources of impurity, which means even an olive-sized portion of them imparts impurity to a person and to implements when touched or carried, or when such a substance is brought into a house, similar to other avot hatuma that we've learned about. So what's implied? He speaks it out. If an olive-sized portion of such a substance is brought into a house, everything in the house, people and implements, contract impurity. For all these substances impart impurity when brought into a house, like a person, just like the person who's afflicted with Tzaraat, if he came into a home, everything would be infected, as it were. So too, a portion of this home brought into another tent, oil, house would become impure. And it's forbidden to benefit from them at all, right? It doesn't just impart impurity, but anything that is left over, broken out, taken from these homes, you can't benefit from this. If one burns them and makes them into lime, it's forbidden to benefit from it. As implied, the way the Torah refers to this, it says, Tzaraat mam'eret. Mam'eret means it's a curse, which can be interpreted as a command. Consider it as a curse and do not benefit from it. All these materials should be discarded outside the city, even if it is not surrounded by a wall. This point that he says, even if it's not surrounded by a wall, you'll remember that the mitzara, an individual who's been determined to have tzaraat, only has to go out of the city if there's actually a wall. Here we're saying you've got to get rid of it completely. I assume it makes sense because a person will eventually heal from tzaraat and go through his process of ta'ara. But this, as we've learned, can never become ta'ara, and it's always going to be forbidden from benefit. So it's got to go. It's got to go. Halacha bet. A house that is isolated, so this is in the first stage, right? Imparts impurity only from the inside. As the pasuk says, anyone who enters into the house throughout the days of its isolation shall become impure until evening. The emphasis being when you enter into it, right? But a house that has been deemed definitely impure, by contrast, imparts impurity from inside and from outside, meaning if you touch the outside, you also become impure. And this again comes from the pasuk which says, Tzaraat mameret b'bayit tamehu. Right? It is a cursed tzaraat in the house, it's impure. Now, so here's the question. Why does the verse repeat tamehu? Wasn't it impure beforehand? Like, why does the Torah have to say tamehu? It becomes tameh as if only now it becomes tameh. Was it pure beforehand? No, rather the intent is that what we're saying is that now the impurity has increased over and above that which existed previously, and have it deemed impure in its entirety, meaning both inside, and now that it's being definitely termed tzaraat, also the outside. That's the further impurity. Hence, it imparts impurity even from the outside. Similarly, the stones on which the blemish is found in an isolated house impart impurity from the outside as well. In other words, even before the entire house is considered impure, the actual stones right away would impart impurity from inside and outside. Halacha Gimel, both a house that is isolated and one that is deemed definitely impure impart impurity when they exist inside another structure. So what does this mean? When there was a house built over a blemished house, whether one that was isolated or one that was deemed definitely impure, or so that, there's a structure over a structure, or he says, if there was a tree that stood over such a house. Now there's a person who stands under the tree, so the tree is going over the house, and there's a gap, and the person's under the tree. Or if somebody enters into the outer house, not the actual structure that was impure, in both cases, or enters the house, both of them are impure. The rationale is that he and the impure house are under one covering. And we're familiar with this idea from the Tumat Meis, the idea of a covering that within which the Tumah spreads, and if we go into it, we contract that Tumah. Similarly, if a blemished stone was brought inside a structure and placed down there, everything in the house then becomes impure. If such a stone was placed under a tree, so it's sitting there, and then a pure person, a person who's tahara, walks past it, he becomes impure. If the pure person was standing if the circumstances were different, the pure person was standing on the tree, and then someone who was carrying it walked past, that doesn't contract impurity because it was mobile, it was momentary. It's only if he places it down there, then the person will contract impurity. The rationale is that the place of a blemished entity has the same status as he does. In other words, where you put it, then it will impart impurity. But if he just walks past it, that's not going to impart it. This applies to blemished persons, implements, stones, wood, and mortar. So if a person stood under the same tree for a while, it would impart it. Or if you put any of these things there. But if someone, Torah, was standing under the tree and someone just quickly walked by, that would not impart impurity. Halacha 4. When a person holds his hand over a blemished stone, or the stone is held above him, then he's not impure unless he actually touches it, because it's not a full covering. So it would be just touching that would impart the impurity. When a ritually pure person enters an impure house backwards, this is a fascinating law, but if you walked in backwards, even if your entire body enters and just the tip of your nose is sticking out, you remain pure. And he says this is derived from the pasuk that says, V'haba el habayit, one who enters into the home becomes impure. And that implies the Torah only prescribes impurity when one is entering in an ordinary manner. Now, pay attention to the fact that the Rambam says that the tip of your nose is out. Obviously, if his entire body, including the tip of his nose, was under it, he would become tameh. Not because of the entering, but because he's now within a space where there is tumah, just like in the previous halachot that we learned. But it's fascinating that because the pasuk says you only become impure when you enter, walking in backwards is not considered entering. So long as a little bit of your body remains outside, you're not yet tameh. Halacha 6. When a ritually pure person inserted his head and the majority of his body into an impure house, meaning not his whole body, but his head and the majority, then already it affects his entire body. He contracts impurity. Similarly, when a portion of a ritually pure garment, and he gives the measurement, 3 fingers by 3 finger breadths, is put into the house, then the entire garment becomes impure. And when any portion of the inner space of an earthenware container enters into an impure house, it becomes impure. And other kalim, other than earthenware, which has that unique halacha that only becomes impure from the airspace, but they would only contract impurity if the majority is brought in. But once the majority is brought in, the entirety is impure, and it's immediate. By contrast, we'll see in a moment. When does the bab apply? To garments or vessels that were taken into the house when no one was wearing them. But here's an interesting exclusion. If somebody was wearing, and it mentions here a Jewish person, so a Jewish person enters into a blemished house and you're wearing your clothes, his shoes and rings on his hands. So the person will become impure immediately as soon as you step in there, or as soon as the majority of your body steps in there. But the clothing remain pure. So long as he's only there for a few moments. But if he remains there for a length of time that it would take someone to eat 3 egg-sized portions of bread from wheat together with some other condiment, as the verse implies, one who lies in the house will launder his garments, and one who eats in the house will launder his garments. Laundering garments means you have to put it to clean it from impurity. Now, what the Rambam is going to say is, why does the pasuk have to say one who lies in the house or one who eats in the house, right? Because you might conclude that you only become impure, or the garments only become impure if you actually ate, but that's not true, because we know that if you walk in the house even without eating, you would become impure. So this is what the Rambam is explaining now. Now, would one think that a person's garments do not contract impurity until he eats in the blemished house? Obviously not. So what's the pasuk telling us then? Instead, the intent of the verse mentioning eating is to establish an equation between eating and lying. Meaning, to clarify that the measure of time necessary for one who lies there, and lying doesn't mean lying, it could be sitting also, or remaining there. The measure of time necessary to contract impurity is the measure of time associated with eating. And this is the definition of eating. And the same law would apply to one who lies, sits, or one who just stands in that place. So he himself is impure immediately, but the garments that he's wearing will only become impure so long as he stands there for this amount of time. If he remains there for long enough time to eat the above-mentioned measure of food, his garments contract impurity. Halacha 7. When a person enters an afflicted house carrying his garments on his shoulders, he's not wearing them, but he's carrying them. Or his shoes or his rings are in his hand. Then they become impure immediately. For only the garments that are saved, for the only garments that are saved, from becoming impure immediately are the ones that he's wearing, because of the exclusion in the pasuk. Similarly, when a non-Jew or an animal enters into an afflicted house, and they've got garments that they're actually wearing, the garments contract impurity right away because the non-Jew, and similarly an animal, they themselves don't contract impurity. So it's as if the garment is being brought in just as is. And the only exclusion to the garments that would require you to be there for a longer period is if someone who would become impure themselves was wearing it. That's clear. Halacha 8. When a person was standing in a blemished house, so you're standing in the house, so you walked in immediately and you're wearing your ring, right? And then you put your hand outside of the house while you're wearing those rings. He says the rings will contract impurity, even though they're outside of the house, so long as he remains there for the time that we've described, the amount of time that one would need to eat, because the majority of him is still in the house. He can't say, my hand and ring are outside the house. Similarly, if a person is standing outside and then he inserts his hands inside an afflicted house, his hands alone contract impurity. Now we're going to learn a little bit more about this idea that hands become impure. It's kind of independent of the rest of the body. And what he's saying here is that a Tzaraat house would impart impurity if you stick just your hands in it. If you kept them it would be if you kept them for an amount of time necessary to eat the measure of food mentioned, then also his rings would contract impurity. If not, the rings would be pure. But the hands themselves would become impure right away, not his entire body, unless it's his head, a majority of the body, as we described just previously. Halacha 9. When the contents of a container are saved from contracting impurity because of a sealed covering under shelter where a corpse is found, they are saved from contracting impurity in an afflicted house when the container is covered. You'll remember we learned about this, what we call a samid seal, when there's a strong seal on something. Even if it's in an ohel where there's a tumat mace, it doesn't become impure. He said the same thing would apply to a house where has tzaraat. And then there were other exceptions. He says whenever the contents of a container are saved from contracting impurity because they are covered, and as when they don't need a full seal, they just need the covered in a shelter where a corpse is found, the same rules would apply over here. They would remain pure even if they were uncovered in an afflicted house. What's this talking about? When there are earthenware, stone, or earthen containers, or the like that contain food, beverages, and implements, and they were covered in an afflicted house, the containers and everything they contain remain pure, even though they are not sealed closed. When there is either another scenario, when there's either a storage pit or a cistern in an afflicted house, the implements in them are pure, even though they are open. Similar laws like we had in the house of, in a place where there was a tumat mace. Now, in this final halacha, the Rambam reverts to more of a broad kind of moral from the laws of Tzaraat, rather than strictly the halacha pertaining to ascertaining the tumah and how it's transmitted from all the different types, whether it be individual, the clothing in the house. The Rambam is going to teach us a moral from these laws. So he says like this: Tzaraat is a collective term including many afflictions that do not resemble each other, as we've learned, right? For the one we've got is the winding of a person's skin is called Tzaraat, as is the falling out of some hair of the hair or the head or the beard, and the change of the color of clothes or houses. And it's all called Tzaraat. So it's a generic term for all these things. Now, this change that affects clothes and houses, which the Torah describes with the general term Tzaraat, is not a natural occurrence. Instead, and this is why we're always careful not to translate it as leprosy, right? Because instead it is a sign and a wonder prevalent amongst the Jewish people to warn them against Lashon Hara, undesirable speech. And this is what he explains. This is the process that happens. When a person speaks Lashon Hara, the walls of his house change color. If he repents, the house will be purified. If however he persists in his wickedness until the house is destroyed, as we've learned the steps that would bring that about, then the leather implements in his home, upon which he sits and lies, they would change color. If he repents, they will be purified. If he persists in his wickedness until they are burnt, the clothes he's wearing will change color. If he repents, they will be purified. If he persists in his wickedness until they are burnt, his skin undergoes changes and he develops tzaraat. This causes him to be isolated and for it to be made known that he must remain alone so that he will not be involved in the talk of the wicked, which is folly and lashon hara. So he's telling us this is designed as a miraculous early warning system for a person to stop and introspect, primarily about their speech, lashon hara. And if you don't get the message, eventually you're going to be forced to be isolated. As Rashi says on the pasuk in last week's parasha, that you're isolated because you isolated others through your speech. And he says This is what the Torah is warning about, right? The Torah warns about this. And the pasuk says as follows: take care with regard to Tzaraat Be'elemish. Remember what Hashem, your God, did to Miriam. And this is, by the way, one of what we call the 6 remembrances that we're meant to mention every day. Recall what Hashem did to Miriam. Now, why is Miriam the paradigm? This is what the Torah is implying. Contemplate what happened to the prophetess Miriam. She spoke. Who did she speak against? Her brother. Now, what was her relation with her brother? She was older than him. Not only that, she's the one that raised him. And she had endangered herself to save him from the sea. And as you'd think, she has the right to say something about this guy. He owes everything to her. Right? She did not, and not only that, when she said, what did she actually say? She didn't speak pejoratively of him. She merely erred in equating him with other prophets. And Moshe himself did not object to any of this. It wasn't about a personal slight to him. As the Torah says, the man Moshe was exceedingly humble. Nevertheless, what happens? We see that she was immediately punished with Tzaraat. Certainly, as if that's the paradigm, we need to remember, what's the message? What's the moral? An inference can be made with regard to the wicked and foolish men who speak extensively about great and wondrous matters. Therefore, a person who seeks to structure, in other words, if we don't have all those, positives, and we're talking about other people, we can be certain that this is a terrible behavior, and the results that we then invite ourselves on ourselves are going to be negative. Therefore, a person who seeks to structure his course of conduct shall distance himself from their gatherings and from speaking to them, so that you will not become caught up in the web of their wickedness and foolishness. Again, it's a broad moral call. Be careful what type of conversations you allow yourself to be drawn into, and the type of conversations that you initiate, and the people that you engage with in these types of conversations. And he just speaks this out again. This is the path followed by the gathering of wicked fools. If you want to know what type of conversation you should stay away from. In the beginning, they speak excessively about empty matters. As the pasuk says, the talk of a fool is characterized by the multitude of words. As a result of this, they come to speak negatively of the righteous, as reflected in the verse in Tehillim. May the lying lips be silent, those which speak falsehood about a righteous man. As a consequence, they will become accustomed to speaking against the prophets and casting aspersions on their words, as reflected in the book of Chronicles. They would abuse the messengers of Hashem, scorn his words, and mock his prophets. And this would lead them to deny Hashem's existence entirely, as reflected in the verse in the book of Kings. And the children of Israel spoke in secret things that were not true against Hashem, their Lord. It sounds dramatic, but it's not so far-fetched to see. We know how these conversations devolve into things like this. And this is what the Rambam is saying. You see this expressed in these different verses. In this vein, the Tehillim states, they set their mouths against heaven and their tongues strut on earth. What caused them to set their mouth against heaven? Their tongues, which previously were given free rein on earth. How important and how careful we have to be with our speech. This is the speech of the wicked that is caused by loitering on the street corners, frequenting the assemblies of commoners, and spending time at the parties of drunkards. I can give you a number of other contexts where this type of speech is not uncommon and we should avoid. In contrast, and this is really the message to end on a positive note, the speech of proper Jewish people only concerns words of Torah and wisdom. Therefore, the Holy One, blessed be He, assists them and grants them merit because of it. As the Prophet Malachi says, then those who fear Hashem conversed, each person with his fellow, and Hashem listened and paid heed. And the book of remembrance was composed before him for those who fear Hashem and contemplate his name. And with that, we say, blessed be the merciful one who's granted us assistance in completing the laws of Tzaraat. Okay, let's go to our test our knowledge over here. The first question, when the verse teaches that a house that has been deemed definitely impure or definitively impure imparts impurity, what does it include? One, those who enter the house become impure. The one who touches even the outside of the house becomes impure. The one who touches the area of the Tzaraat becomes impure. Two,
Number
right?
two. Number two, yeah.
Excellent, right? Because it's the additional tumah means even the outside touching the outside. Question 2, do the stones of a house that was destroyed because of Tzaraat impart impurity? Yes, if they are touched. Yes, if they are touched or carried. No.
2. Number 2 again.
Okay, good, excellent, right? It's a primary source of tumah, and as we learned, even if it went taken into a building, it would also impart impurity within the ohel. Do one's garments become impure if he enters an impure house? Okay, let's read the options carefully. If he was wearing them, they become impure immediately. If he was carrying them, only if he was there for a while. If he was wearing them, only if he was there for a while. If he was carrying them, they become impure immediately. Yes, they become impure immediately.
1 or 2.
Hey, and now we have the shofar blast. 2 to 2, eh?
Okay.
Wow, you're serious. Why was Miriam punished with Tzaraat? Because she spoke negatively about Moshe? Because she equated Moshe with other prophets, or because she questioned Hashem's ways?
Number 2. 2.
Yes, I don't know who designed this today's quiz, but
Easy.
all you needed is a 2, eh? Okay.
So what do we do for a siyum?
It's a great idea. I think you need add a l'chaim to your lunch. Okay.
And can it be fruit juice?
Whatever you're saying, l'chaim, whatever you're saying.
Already
You have some beer or
prepared
whiskey, it's a good idea to finish it today because you've got a week to go. You've got to get rid of it. So
Thanks.
Thanks, Rabbi.
thank
Thank
you.
you, Rabbi.
Yes.